Hello, I'm Morris Ruddick. We've been talking about Jewish business secrets. We've taken a look at the foundations, the model, and gifts that are vital to understanding the dynamics of what have given Jews the renown of being a people of business. Now, before we dig into the dynamics of entrepreneurship, I want to cover some background about Jewish culture. The cultural identity of Jews, of being a prophetic people of God, is a factor of much significance, explaining why Jews have been so successful in business. The strength of Jewish cultural identity has made them to be a culture within other cultures. It goes back to why Moses told them that if they would adhere to the instructions to be faithful to God and teach these things to their children and their children's children, that they would be the head and not the tail, and would stand out, excelling above all the other societies of the earth. These factors comprising Jewish identity has enabled Jews to survive when other civilizations they have been a part of have come and then faded away. This strategy that has enabled Jews to endure over the centuries ties into the spiritual, unseen world. In simple terms, it is explained by the fact that there is good and bad in the world. And sometimes the bad can be very subtle and deceiving. This unseen dimension operating around us is different in different locales around the world. It is what we refer to as the spiritual climate of an area. The spiritual climate of an area relates to the struggle between good and evil, of righteous power and corrupt power. So understanding the cultural dynamics provides keen insights into the uniqueness of entrepreneurship from a Jewish perspective. I've noted that the foundations of Jewish culture provide a much greater emphasis on the bottom-up way of looking at business. Embracing the dynamics comprising Jewish business secrets is going to require a different way of thinking. The way of thinking that results from Jewish cultural foundations is more creative and more a big picture or strategic in its way of viewing things. Jewish culture employs excellence and discipline in its stewardship and an identity and faith in God that releases God's authority to harness the spiritual climate of a society. I've illustrated this with the stories of Abraham and Joseph. These foundations of Jewish culture didn't stop with Abraham and Joseph. Moses outlined the framework for the Abrahamic model to inoculate God's own from the subtle wickedness of the world and become a society of the righteous, living for God. David demonstrated the priority of discerning and acting on God's heart as the path to leading God's people. This shaped a society of diverse factions of God's own into a kingdom that prompted awe for God and his people from all those around them. Jesus then raised the bar to the standard of these foundations and opened the gates to the authority that governs the mix of cultures, economies, and seats of power. So the kingdom dynamic for applying righteous power in a corrupt world hit a new level. To better grasp the dynamic behind Jewish business secrets, we need to look at each of these very significant factors. The God-centered entrepreneurial community, overcoming evil with good and establishing the right spiritual climate, operating a society of God's people that prompts awe, then piercing the veil of the spiritual and becoming a steward of the authority that governs the right balance between culture, the economy, and power. Accomplishing these things within a community will take something more. It means assuming community responsibility. Most Jewish people understand this and will talk about And we will talk about community in more detail as this series progresses. Community, according to the standards outlined by Moses, is both a gift of God and a strategy. It is a significant element of what we're discussing with Jewish Business Secrets. Let me explain with a story that came from a community of believers we brought our program to in Western Africa. During our visit, we were invited to a traditional African wedding held by a seasoned Pentecostal community. The wedding service itself was about 3 hours long. During that time, not only did the bride and groom take their vows, but so did the parents. The parents swore to help the young couple through the stages of being newlyweds and into the time when they began having children. This entailed the parents making public vows and signing a community register noting their commitment. And there was more. An older woman, a great-grandmother, considered wise in the ways of the community, was assigned as a mentor to the wife, as was an older man to the son. They would befriend them and visit them regularly during the first year of the marriage. I was told this community had not had one divorce in 30 years. This community had tapped the wisdom of the Jewish secret of being a culture within a culture. In so doing, they protected themselves against the subtle and not too subtle inroads of witchcraft and ancient evil practices that were known to infiltrate and infect their culture. This example is very Jewish in practice, as it should be. Most Orthodox Jewish communities are set up in this way. During a flight I shared with an Orthodox Jewish woman, I told her about our God's Economy program. She affirmed the importance of community by telling me how the Israeli Orthodox community her daughter was a part of had rallied around her daughter when her husband had died. It didn't stop with the initial days of mourning. It was a responsible social system that not only supported the widow emotionally and provided meals through the months of difficult transition, but it helped her gain employment at the business of one of the members of the community. The social system she described was designed to care for the needs of their own, to ensure there were never any hungry or homeless or any left alone. As it is written, after the time of Jesus, do good to all men, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. Jewish writings state that there should be no poor among us. These are a part of the foundations. This woman's daughter, as were the newlyweds in the African community of believers, were recipients of ancient wisdom, foundations that endure. What Jesus set in motion was not a new religion. What he established was built upon the foundations of the Torah and the prophets. The culture was the same, but Jesus raised the bar to all that had been started by Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, and then elaborated on by the prophets. He demonstrated closing the breach between the natural and the spiritual. He revealed the secret of creativity and opening the gates into the spiritual realm and releasing the authority from his secret of abiding with God to those who would believe. Jesus explained one of the keys of why the Torah indicates that God's people would be the head and not the tail through his parable of the talents, which illustrates how increase is the expected result of good stewardship. Jesus rejected the phoniness and misuse of power of the religious elite and explained things in a way that everyday people could bridge this gap between the natural and spiritual and tap this creativity. He then faced and overcame the greatest obstacle, death, to open the gates to this realm for any who would believe. As has been noted, culturally, Jewish foundations are a lot more Eastern than Western. In this journey of unfolding Jewish business secrets, you're going to become more aware of how these foundations not only overcome evil with good, but enhance the elusive dynamic we refer to as economics, as well as through the wisdom of God's economics, culture, and power, and how they come into balance. Jewish cultural foundations that were set in motion by Abraham were brilliantly anointed and written out for future generations in the books of Moses. Very few cultures have the level of a systematic record of their heritage like the Jews do. As already mentioned, as the core of their identity is that of being a prophetic people of God. These things align Jews in the way that they think and view the world around them. All this goes back to the illumination I got after observing the rampant poverty in Ethiopia, of how the spiritual and economic can progressively make community not only a safe place, but a place that nurtures opportunity for its members. It begins and has a focus on the simple things, of the most basic family-owned enterprises that become the heart of a society that takes care of its own. Larger enterprises within this cultural setting retain the responsibility and community focus. The history of the Rothschild banking empire is one of a network of institutions which had very simple beginnings. It has been run by a single family that supported one another and had an overriding commitment for the good and safety of the Jewish community. So in summarizing, what clearly exudes from the many facets of Jewish culture is captured in the writings of Moses, that if the conditions of the house of Israel's identity and obedience to God's principles and instructions are met, then the Lord would make them to excel above all the other societies on the earth. That premise explains not only their many amazing historical exploits, but more recent Jewish accomplishments detailed in studies such as The Golden Age of Jewish Achievement, authored by Stephen Peace. In a word, it is disproportionate achievement and the mark of the leadership mantle that has influenced the societies of which Jews have been a part over the millennia. This word influence is a vital part of Jewish leadership. At the core of these exploits are foundations impacting the way Jews think. Jewish thinking in turn forms the perspectives for the priorities of what they do that endures. And I'm Morris Ruddick. We've been setting the stage to better understand God's economy and the form of entrepreneurship that comprises our focus of Jewish business secrets. As it has been written by the psalmist, "Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who takes great delight in his instruction. All goes well for the generous man, who lends freely and conducts his business fairly.